Um, One of the important things about we need to understand about our economy is that we can either produce wealth or just move money around the economy. When you deal with just the financial part of money and the service industries, all you're doing is moving money from one person to another, but without creating wealth. How you create wealth is you have to go and get something and combine it together with labour and capital, get capital, material and labour and join it together to produce something which is of greater value. Unfortunately, we actually have, according to statistics of 24th of April 2024, we've seen a massive decline in the area of activity which would actually produce wealth. How you produce wealth in an economy, one way is to dig a hole in the ground and get raw materials from the ground and sell those raw materials to other people, other countries, so that they can actually manufacture products. Not a very good way. It's sort of it's where you have limited. I guess you have limited wealth created from that. The better way is to get that material from the ground, like for example iron ore, and you take it to a factory where you produce steel, and from that steel you go and produce various products, cars, whatever products you want to produce, and then you can sell them and perhaps even get excessive amounts for your country, and you can sell them overseas. This is the better way to produce wealth. So basically what I'm saying to you is that while mining can produce some small amount of wealth, it doesn't produce very much, not as what it could produce. And agriculture also produces wealth, in as much as what you have is you have perhaps if it's on the animal side, you have a few animals and they you increase your stock and you're able to sell the produced animal. You're able to sell that for meat, or you sell the wool for sheep, or the leather from the carcasses. You can sell that and actually produce wealth that way. You can also produce wealth by harvesting forests, as well as you can produce wealth by fishing as well. Unfortunately, these parts of the economy, we've seen a massive decline. 30 years ago, the 13.6% of total employment was in the manufacturing area. Now it's down to about 5%. While the agriculture, forestry and fishing is down to 2.2%. Most of our employment these days is in what's called the service sectors, where 4 out of 5 Australians work in the service sector. Now the service sector, which is pretty vital, I mean that gives you aged care, it gives you health care, it gives you the NDIS, it gives you other things like that. They're essential for sure. But when that is the major part of your employment, you're not creating much wealth at all. And when these things, and a lot of these things, to support these things, we need extra capital. And unfortunately that capital is obtained by borrowings. And so hence we have gone on the path of borrowing heaps of money from overseas. I believe we're well over $1 trillion in debt, which is a horrendous amount of money. We need to change the direction that we go in this country. What we need to do is to support manufacturing. One of the decisions of the current administration is to go for what they call net zero. Well, net zero is, firstly, it's a lie. In the first instance, it's a lie, because you can't have a net zero result. It's not going to happen. Sorry, it's not going to happen at all. It's a mathematical impossibility to run on a net zero equation. But that's what what they're going to do, they're going to fudge the figures to prove that they can. Now, one of our problems we have today is the price of energy in this country. Everybody has seen the price of their electricity increase by huge amounts. And of course, not only has the price increased by huge amounts, what we've also seen is that there's been lots of money being put into different other programs. So it's cost the government a lot of money too. For example, we've been encouraged to get solar panels onto our roofs of our domestic houses. And for that, there's a subsidy given. Now, all of these solar panels, where do they come from? They come from China. Most of them come from, they all come from overseas, as far as I understand. Or virtually all come from overseas. Which means it's very good for the economies overseas, but it's not very good for ours. Because we actually have to pay for these things. And that runs up more debt. So we have these solar panels there, which the government subsidises, which increases the debt. In recent days, we've had information from Tomigo Aluminium. Tomigo Aluminium is a smelter plant just north of Newcastle. They had a contract there to supply, to produce aluminium from raw materials from the ground. They were able to produce this aluminium, and they had a contract supply electricity. At the time they were setting it up, they were told that electricity was the way to go because they would be able to have cheap electricity. And that the future plans of government was the fact that electricity prices were going to decrease. Unfortunately, the prices of electricity have gone up about 300% since that occasion. And so now Tomigo Aluminium is looking at the future potential contracts which they're going to get for the electricity, and it's going to be astronomical, which will possibly make it unviable. In as much as what it means is a lot of their product they were selling overseas, and they will be able to be priced out of the market. So now, the question is, where have we gone wrong? What we've done is we haven't supported the manufacturing industry. With 5,000 people who lose their jobs, and the opportunity to earn wealth for this country has been diminished yet again. We saw the same happen with the departure of Ford and Holden from this country, as well as before that we had Toyota, we had Chrysler depart this country. So we lost all of our car manufacturing. Again, loss of wealth. We have governments in this country who have chosen to purchase trains from overseas rather than to use the local manufacturing people who were well and truly skilled at producing them and doing them at a reasonable price. So we have all of these things which have been failing us over the years, where governments have intentionally chosen not to support the Australian economy, that is the growing wealth of the Australian economy. They have followed a dogma which is incorrectly applied, which is within the economic debate you have this situation where you have, when you have an industry working on something, it is always helpful to have somebody else produce something that specialises in it. Now, for example, when we produce cars in this country, instead of Ford and Holden producing their own gearboxes and differentials, what they had is both of them had Borg Warner produce them for them, because Borg Warner was specialist in that area, and that was an opportunity. That was a very good opportunity advantage for them, which actually was called a comparative advantage. It was a comparative advantage for them to do that because of the research you would have to have by Ford and Holden to improve their diffs and gearboxes would have been costly, whereas Borg Warner was doing that all of the time, and they were able to specialise in that area and become specialised in that and actually be able to be helpful. Now, that did not prevent the wealth production in this country because it was all within this country. But when you actually move that the equation to an overseas country, what you have done is you've disadvantaged the country, because now that wealth is created in the other place. What we did with our clothing industry, the clothing industry shut down, and most of the products were moved off, most of the clothing manufacturers moved off to places like Bangladesh, where people were paid a pittance, and they produced the clothing there. Now, we were giving people subsistence living in these places in Bangladesh and other places to produce our clothing, and we're saying that it was comparative advantage. Well, there's a moral problem there. If we believe that it was wrong to have, if we believe it was wrong to give people to use slave labour, and we needed to pay people in this country a reasonable wage, we ought to be considering that people in other places in the world need to also be paid a reasonable wage. We were talking both sides of our tongue, as I would say. We were talking a forked tongue, because on one hand we were saying how we didn't support slave labour. In fact, the Australian government at the time was condemning South Africa for their apartheid regime, where in South Africa they did intentionally have a black worker would get 25% the pay of a white worker for the same work, simply because of the apartheid regime. Yet they were happy to have Bangladeshis who are having some subsistence living, being locked into a building for 12-hour shifts, and so produce our clothing, and to say that it was good for the economy. Well, it was never good for the economy. It wasn't good for the Bangladeshis, and it certainly was no good for Australia, because what we did is we enhanced slave labour in Bangladesh. What we needed to do, if we wanted to do things right, we wanted to make sure that the people were paid a reasonable wage in Bangladesh. If they were paid a reasonable wage in Bangladesh, then perhaps the clothing manufacturing may have stayed in Australia. Now, as I say, we need to create wealth, but we've got over $1 trillion in debt, and because our service industry, which doesn't produce wealth at all of our service industry does, it actually helps people, and it's very good, it's very vital, but it doesn't produce wealth. And the service industry is very fascinating. It has had a 214.8% growth over the last 30 years. Or in other words, what we have is 4 out of 5 people employed today are working in the service industry. Now, all the service industry does, it takes money, and they get paid for the work they do. And I don't decry that. And their work is important. But when so many people are doing this, and it costs money to do what they do, and they need to have injection of funds. But there's no wealth being created, and so the way they get the goods they need, they have to come in via debt. And so we increase our debt all of the time. With this growth in this industry in the last 5 years, we've seen a 19% growth in the service industry in the last 5 years. This needs to stop. We need to see what we can really afford. Now, I think that the people who need the assistance, sure, it's probably true to say they do need the assistance, but we've actually got to do something else. We've got to make sure the economy is working, so we produce the economy. The reason why many people can't afford to buy a house today is for this very reason alone. We are not wealth creating. What we are doing is we're just spinning money around the economy. Now, another fascinating piece of information. Back in the 1960s and 1950s, the person in charge of a business, they would get 5 to 10 times the salary of their lowest paid worker. Now it's 1,500 to 2,000 times, which is a demonstration of why we actually have this huge gap between those who have and have not in this country, and it's increasing all of the time. The government measures the economy by the GDP. Now, the GDP is basically how the so-called proverbial dollar moves around the economy. Now, it doesn't tell you anything at all. It just tells you how quickly a dollar moves around the economy. When I was at university studying this, I argued the case against this being a measure of the economy, of the health of the economy. And I proposed the proposition that the way you can tell if an economy is good or bad is by how much is left over, what residual is left over after the essentials are purchased. And I would go to the low income earner and I would look at them. I would look at their income. I would see that they have supplied their basic services, which are housing, clothing and food. And electricity probably as well, part of that. Once you've supplied that, then you ask the question, is the residual amount of money left over, is that increasing or decreasing? If it's decreasing, the economy is bad. If it's staying the same, it's stagnant. If it's increasing, the economy is improving. Empirically, what the last several years have demonstrated, this what is left over is declining to the point that many people have nothing left over. And in fact, they depend upon charity for even some parts of the essentials. We need to change this. We need to change the direction. And the only way we can do that is by getting rid of this government. We need to put some people in place who are capable of understanding how an economy works, why it works, and what to do about it, and how to do something about it. I'm involved with a political party called Christians for Community, and our team are well and truly prepared to take on this challenge and to fix the economy. It will not be easy, we understand that. It will take some time, we understand that. But it must happen. The longer we leave it, the worse the problem will be, and the longer it will take to correct. So I ask for your support for our party so that we can actually do something about fixing this economy. If you want more information about us, go to www.christiansforcommunity.com.au and you'll find out more information on our website. Thank you very much. See you, bye.